Welcome back to part 2 of our delicious conversation with Owen Fitzpatrick. He has a TED Talk that is gone pretty viral, done all kinds of stuff. He's written 9 books. Guy makes me look like I'm lazy. He has worked with Google, Coca-Cola. He's coached billionaires, Olympic athletes. His TED Talk is called Mind Control. He's done some amazing things. In part 1 of the show, we talked about the cults that we're in and whether we know it or not. And we've talked about these echo chambers that we're sort of allowed ourselves to be pushed into through social media, through political, social movements, and how we end up in this place where we can't really talk to each other. We think the only thing to do is to just not talk about it. I know it's not the same in England anymore, but back when I was a kid, when I first became interested in politics, when I was about 11, right through till I left, people spoke openly about politics. It was a really good conversation. Now I know it's pretty much like the United States. It's a conversation you can't really have. And I wanted to come back here with Owen and want to talk about how can we open these conversations from your point of view? What do we need to do to be able to have conversations? Because as I've talked about with many of my political friends, we are living with the loud minority and the quiet majority. So there's the minority, the extreme left, and the minority, the extreme right, which apparently make up about 17% on both sides. And everybody else in the middle is just going, oh, geez, just shut up. I don't want to hear any more of this. And so the only voices that are heard are these loud extremists. And we in the middle have got to speak up because we actually do want to talk to each other and we do want to find common ground. How do we get there? What's your thoughts on?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is to listen to what you just said, which is, let's say, the 17%, to listen to the fact that we're exposed to the extreme on both sides, which means we're exposed to, and what we're really focusing on is the extreme on the other side. And therefore, a lot of people are living in a reality tunnel where they believe that the way the other side thinks is this extreme way. And constantly, everyone who talks about it, because it gets more traction online, every time they turn on CNN or Fox News or whatever their media news channel of choice is, or every time they go on social media, they see constant examples of the extreme side because that's what gets attention. The problem is we're now living in a world where we think that's reality. We think everybody or 90% of people actually think like this. And it's also probably influencing more and more people to think like that as well. So because of that, recognizing that it's only 17% and recognizing that most people are actually in the middle, that's the first step. The second step then is to realize or answer the question, well, why? Why do we struggle with having that conversation? And I think a big answer is because the reason I struggle to have the conversation is because, number one, I don't think I'll get anywhere with you because you're so extreme in my mind. But number two, if you're right, then I'm wrong. And me being wrong in this context, according to you, is me being a despicable human being, me being a very poor person, me being a communist or a fascist, depending on what narrative you buy into. So my choice is I can agree with you, which would go against what I actually believe. So I'm not going to do that. But then if I disagree with you, I'm now a fascist or communist. What kind of double bind is that, where you got two options and neither of them is where you want to go? So a big part of it is learning to be able to demonstrate respect. And there's different philosophies or approaches to this. There's a concept called deep canvassing, which is something that was built in the late 2000s, right? About 2007, 2008, which is this methodology whereby they went door to door to try to, in fact, change on certain social issues. And they had a great success rate and involved a 20-minute conversation where you would ask the person about their beliefs. Let's say it was about gay marriage. And you would ask them about their beliefs about gay marriage and why they believe that. And you would ask them to elaborate on that and what examples or experiences they've had with it. And then once you did that for a few minutes, you would then share your point of view. You wouldn't disagree. You wouldn't give them facts. You wouldn't snap their ear off with like all of this data as to why they're wrong and why this is a wrong issue. You would simply share your story and your experience and your thoughts and why you believe what you believe. And they were able to move the needle by, I think it was 3 or 4%, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it's huge in the context of voting. And so the reason that worked, or the primary reason that worked, was because it was demonstrating respect for a person that has a different point of view. So me and you, Dov, we can disagree politically, And it doesn't mean I think you're an idiot. It doesn't mean I think you're the worst person in the world. You're like the most evil person on the planet. It doesn't mean I think that you're a lunatic for believing in this particular person or believing in this particular way. It simply means that I'm respecting you, that you have a different way of thinking. And so when I went to North Korea, that's what I had to do as well, is because I was there talking to these people that had a completely different view of the world, because the information they were given was very different to the information I was given. We talked about the Korean War, and their interpretation of the Korean War, and the story as I was told it, was that the North Koreans were invaded by the South Koreans, or as they were called, the puppet government of the South and the evil American regime. And so when you recognize that having conversations like that means being able to go to the person and really be curious and try to understand, what do they believe and why do they believe it? Not to interrupt them to go, oh, I can't believe you believe that. Oh, that's ridiculous. Oh, that's fake news. Oh, that's false. Oh, that's a conspiracy. That's wrong. Oh, that's mainstream media. Oh, you're a puppet. You're a sheep. Instead of falling into that trap, we stop and we just ask questions. And when you do, the shot that you have to change their minds is as they start to elaborate, they start to realize the holes in their own argument. But even if they don't get that far, you still are able to have a productive conversation where you're able to agree to disagree, which is the important element. It's almost like we've stopped giving ourselves permission to disagree with each other. And when you do give yourself...
To respectfully disagree.
Yes.
That's the key, right?
It's the key word there, as you mentioned, is respectfully, which means when you disagree, the other person doesn't feel like you're judging them as a certain type of person. And people find it so difficult to do this because people are so convinced that they're right. And all they're seeing online is extremist views that agree with them. And that's making things so much harder to actually do. But if we actually stop and we share the stories of why we believe what we believe, we realize the Dunning-Kruger effect is right there. The same thing that I mentioned earlier, Socrates, what he tried to do is, the wisest thing that I know is that I know nothing. I paraphrase it there, but that's still true 2,400 years later. We need to recognize that, because that gives us a shot at being able to connect with each other again.
It's fascinating. I was in Vietnam. I decided I wanted to go and tour the War Museum. Not a good idea. Not exactly a feel-good moment, but I went and studied it and spent a long time in there, left feeling quite dark and sad, and came back and wrote a post about how history is written by the winners. It's fascinating to me because I went on this tour of these prisons in Vietnam, and they're showing me how tiny these prison cells are and what the Americans did to the Vietnamese people. And it's exactly the same stories of what I heard on the other side about what the North Vietnamese did to the Americans and how they were tortured. It's exactly the same, like no different, except they did it, not us. And so it's very much that history is written by the winners. And so in Vietnam, the winners are Vietnam, because actually people don't realize Vietnam's still a communist country. It's open to tourism now, but it's got its own history and it sees things in a different way than we see it. And yes, there was American interference in Korea and in Vietnam and all the rest of it. But it's really interesting to me that that becomes the national narrative. And once it becomes a national narrative, it's very difficult to give it up and remain in that country, because it feels like you are constantly in battle. And so I bring these things down from the macro into the micro, and that is, what country do you live in? And by that, I don't mean nationally. What is the country of your belief? I talk a lot about this with the people I work with. What is the country of your belief? Because in the country of your belief, you've surrounded yourself with people who believe what you believe. And if you decide to change, quote unquote, and believe something different, can you live in that country? Because oftentimes people will say, you've changed, and we go, no, I haven't, instead of saying thank you.
Yeah.
But because we don't want to lose the person, we don't want to lose our nation,
Yeah.
we forego a new belief. We forego our evolution, our growth. And so we want to change and we want to grow, but there is a cost to doing so. And oftentimes that is that you're going to lose your nation. And I think that that's part of the resistance to the change that we talked about in part one, in the identity piece of supported by this nation of others who believe what I believe. There are a lot of people I know who voted Trump, who hated Trump, and vice versa, like we talked about before. The other people are like, you've gone insane. There's no other way of explaining it than you've gone insane.
Yeah.
As opposed to some valid points.
You hit the nail on the head. It's the social cost of doing so is too high for people to pay. And if you think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, if we get thrown out of our tribe, we're as good as dead because we don't have the support that we need. And therefore, getting back to my own suicidal story, that was all because of my social standing in my own mind. I felt I was a loser, I was a reject. And once again, that became scarier than death. In other words, I was willing to choose ending my life versus living in a torturous world where I was mocked and bullied and laughed at by other people. I can't remember who said it, but there was a podcast I was listening to a professor talk about this, and they said social death for a lot of people is worse than actual death. And it's like this notion that we're trying so hard to be part of that group, and if you don't toe the line, you will get thrown out, you'll get abandoned. And taking the Vietnam Museum, I think it was the same museum as you. And there's also in Tibet, I went along in Lhasa to the museum there, and it's obviously run by the Chinese. And they have a thing in 1950 or whenever it was, Tibet was liberated into motherland China. And I've never heard the word liberated into, that preposition into after the word liberated. In South Africa, again, learning the chronicles and stories. Then when I went to Rwanda, that was the toughest experience from a learning point of view I ever got.
Did you go to North Korea to understand that indoctrination?
Yes.
That's why you went there?
I'd done a lot of research. I'd read books on North Korea. I'd watched documentaries on it. But I was fascinated with what happens when you're closed off to the world and you've got effectively full control over the information. And so when I went there, because I was Irish, that allowed me to go through less hoops than you would do if you're American. So as an Irish person, I was able to, it was still hard, but I was able to get a visa. You have to leave your phone and laptop and everything else in China. I flew from Beijing into Pyongyang, and then I was there for a week or so. They put 2 guides with you the whole time. They bring you on organized tours. But I got to know the guides. I got to have a few drinks with the guides and got some deep conversations and got to really understand a lot more. And I think it was because it was in a solo trip. I didn't join one of these groups. It was just me and my 2 guides. It was one of the most enlightening experiences I've ever had. One thing I did like, and I kind of mean this in sort of a dark way, but obviously there's terrible atrocities and it's awful from a human rights perspective. But I tell you what, I enjoyed watching the news because the news was always positive. It was always good news about how great the government was, how great the country was. It was nice basking, honestly, Duff. It was nice basking in a world where I'd turn on the news and you'd be like, no, today we did this and we're amazing and our government's amazing and the dear leader's amazing and blah, blah, blah. It was nice getting a bit of that just for a week or so.
Even if it's tongue in cheek, yeah, it's pretty cool. So what took you to Rwanda? Because there was a genocide there. Talk about dark.
Honestly, I remember I was 15 or so when that occurred. So that was like 1993 or 1994. No, 1994. And 1 million people died within 100 days or so. An insane amount. And it wasn't just 1 million people died from like bombs or guns. 1 million people died like hardcore, horrendous stories. And this is the interesting piece, is that what happened was you had, for many years, the Belgians were sort of in charge of Rwanda. And then when they left in charge one of the minorities, which is a group called the Tutsis. And this is the 20% of or so of the population, more or less, right?
Yeah.
And the main population, the Hutus. And what happened is that the Tutsis were in charge and obviously got the best of things because they were the government. And at some point it was flipped over. And then there was a conspiracy about one of the politicians, their plane crashed or whatnot. There was sort of a nefarious conspiracy about what happened. Anyway, it all erupted. And the Hutus leadership decided that the Tutsis were dangerous and were at risk, and we needed to pretty much exterminate them. So they used terms like cockroaches. These are not humans, they're cockroaches, and we need to kill all the cockroaches.
The dehumanization is what has always been effective for othering people. It's the same that happened with the Jews. It's the same that's happened with the Palestinians. Anytime you get that behavior, it's dehumanization.
It's easy for people to say. They just do it. It's the opposite of euphemisms where they go collateral damage. We accidentally bombed a hospital. collateral damage. It's like, this is murdered women and children and innocent people here. But if we say collateral damage, it doesn't sound as scary. These terms, they demonize this group, they dehumanize, as you mentioned. And as a result, it's easier for people to conceptualize. And then Cialdini's commitment to consistency, the whole action piece of the scale framework kicks in. Once you've done it once, then there's no going back. And if you actually turn around and realize you made a mistake, that's such a strong traumatic experience of cognitive dissonance. You don't want it. So therefore, you keep doing it and you justify it to yourself, and you use your logic to justify why it was necessary. You believe hook, line, and sinker in this story that these are cockroaches per se, and therefore you get away with it. And for me, the reason I went to North Korea was this was the example, one of the examples of Rwanda, a huge group of people that were, we'll use the term brainwashed, but I don't even mean that, but brainwashed into committing mass murder. And these are ordinary people. It's not like Rwanda had so many evil people. So obviously, as someone who's like dedicated his life to being obsessed with why we believe what we believe, that was the place to go to. So I got to speak to people who lived through it, and I got to go to the museum. Like you said, I walked out of that museum and I was broken. I was crying my eyes out for about 2 hours. I didn't even hail a cab for about 2 hours. I just walked around the grounds until I could compose myself enough to get into a taxi, because there was graphic stories. And now they've made it illegal to use the terms Hutu or Tutsis, because that's the big part of it. These are arbitrary names that don't really have that much of a background. And that's one of the interesting things about beliefs, is that it was sometimes size of head, color of eyes, sometimes the amount of cattle they owned. That would be what the Belgians used to dictate whether or not a person's a Hutu or a Tutsi. But if you think about it, it's like Catholics and Protestants in the north of Ireland. A lot of the Catholics and Protestants that, let's say, inverted commas, hate each other, don't even know the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism from a technical perspective. A lot of the, let's say, in terms of the Muslim culture, you've got the Shiites and the Sunnis, and there's a massive amount of hate there. And once again, if you break it down, the actual differences of opinion, a lot of times people aren't as aware or aren't as educated about it, but it's just like, it's the other. And it's the same, like you were bringing up earlier, the cult mentality. It's like, we are the us and you are the them. And the story I tell myself is, we're the goodies and you're the baddies. And that is like a pre-program that we've had from before civilization, our tribe versus your tribe. And unfortunately, it means that at its worst level, you can see millions of people dying as a result of this. It's still happening across the planet. There's still a ridiculous amount of inhumane acts being justified by saying, well, and again, you hear the same justifications, the same bullshit over and over again to try to make us not lose sight of our virtue. And it's really hard to deal with.
It's really fascinating for me, and I know for you too, from a point of view of studying deep psychology, is how the terms like narcissist and psychopath and sociopath, and these terms are now thrown around much easier than they were when you and I started studying. They're terms that are thrown around without really a lot of understanding. And what I find really fascinating, though, is they just did a movie that won an Oscar. It's an example that I talked about in my seminars for 20 years. And I said, how does the Nazi soldier at the death camp walk children into the gas chamber and then go home to his family and play with his children? How does that possibly happen? And they're like, I don't know. So is this person a covert sociopathic, psychopathic murderer? Or are they a decent human being with a job that happens to be a psychopathic job? And they're like, I don't know. It's the ability to compartmentalize based on othering. This is the thing, because when you talked about those people in Rwanda, and the same happened in Cambodia, where people were doing horrendous things under Pol Pot, just like unimaginable, who would have said themselves, this is not a possibility for me to do as a human being. And so it really brings up this piece around change, like what facilitates change and what facilitates justification for change. And sometimes those external forces, and sometimes it's a combination of the external forces and an internal, what I call emotional logic, or rationalization to tell oneself rational lies, to tell ourselves these rationalizing lies, validating lies that allow us to do things that are beyond comprehension. Because as you said, there were people doing things in Rwanda and the other countries we mentioned. If you'd interviewed them 5 years before, it would have been unthinkable for them.
Yeah.
And so it's very easy for us to black, white, right, wrong, yes, no, without understanding the circumstance of something. One of my best friends in Australia, Mike, his dad, Gerhard, when I met his dad, he was in his 60s. He had grown up in Germany in the Second World War. Now remember, by birth, I'm Jewish. And Mike and I were good friends, and I loved Gerhard. He was a great guy, and I always end up talking to him and enjoying our conversations. But I remember asking him about the Hitler Youth, and he would never talk to me about it until the last year I was there. And I asked him again, and he talked to me about it, and he said, it was like the Boy Scouts. He goes, if you wanted to go outdoors, we were all poor. You wanted to go outdoors, you wanted to play games, you wanted to go to camp. Of course you're in the Hitler Youth. You wanted to get a badge, you wanted to do well, you told on people who were saying that they liked the Jews. He goes, we didn't think of it as being bad or being good. We were just part of something. And this plays so well to this understanding of how tribal we are, that we will forego our own ethics and rationale and logic to be part of the tribe.
And I think there's one other element to it as well, Dov. It's that when we look at the science of stories and we look at the stories we tell, and this happens for like main characters in a movie. And I can't remember who said it to me. I think it might have been Bob McKee, the top screenwriting guru out there. He's an incredible man. One of the things is that no villain sees himself as a villain. Like no villain, Lex Luthor didn't turn around and think to himself, I'm a bad villain. People don't go in and think to themselves that way. Even Thanos, in terms of the Marvel movies, he thought he was doing good. He was going to click his fingers, spoiler alert, and try, well, I'm not telling you about what happened, but his goal was to be able to kill one half or make one half completely evaporate of people in the universe. And so the notion is villains don't see themselves as villains and heroes don't see themselves as villains. So the reality is that we rationalize so that we can maintain our virtue. We can maintain our feeling as the heroes and the protagonists in our own stories because no one perceives them as that. So if, for example, you're growing up in Nazi Germany, what happens is you're surrounded by other people who all believe in a certain way. And just like we all might have said or done things 20 years ago that now when we think about ourselves, we think, oh, that was terrible. I can't believe we joked around about that. I can't believe we used that word or this word to insult each other. But it was normal then. And the normalization then became something that we didn't even think about. And now we look back at it retrospectively and we go, oh, wow, that's embarrassing. Oh, and we see why it was wrong. But once again, that's a small micro example of the much bigger thing, which is you're surrounded by people constantly. Everyone is believing in the same narrative, the same story. These are the enemy. These are poisoning this and that and the other. And before you know it, you're falling hook, line, and sinker into this belief. Or even if you don't fully believe it, you're scared not to. It's the emotional side of it. I'm afraid not only am I going to be ostracized, but I could be killed if I defend this group or that group. And that can be for a lot of people. And it's easy for every virtue signaler in the world nowadays to go, oh, if I was there, I would have killed Hitler. I would have done this. I would have done that. Maybe. Probably not, though.
Probably not.
And recognizing that is hard for us to do because we all like to see ourselves as good people. None of us are the villains. But the capacity for human beings to do really messed up stuff isn't something that they're turned to evil. And that's a convenient way of thinking, but it's not necessarily accurate. More often than not, they're twisted to a narrative that still maintains their feelings of being virtuous, but it's just being virtuous through violence. It's like when people go away and fight a war, they believe they're doing the right thing. They're fighting for right reasons. And sometimes you could argue they are. But again, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And looking at it through different lens makes it much messier. I have very strong feelings about certain things going on in the world. I tend to keep them to myself, but I have very strong feelings that makes me feel bad. But when I talk with others about them, I never share them, not just because I don't want to, but it's also because I'm trying to get people to realize that just like I have to do this, which is looking at it from a multitude of perspectives so that we can see just because you feel this way or just because you're telling yourself the story doesn't necessarily mean you're 100% correct. If more of us did that, we'd find more ways to have better conversations, I think.
Yeah, I call that generous curiosity.
Love it.
I just wrote a paper on that, on generous curiosity. And in that, I cite the number one terrorist in the world at the time, named by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, was, any idea who I might say?
Was it Mandela?
Exactly, it was Mandela.
Yeah.
Who was hailed as the greatest peace bringer and still is held that way. So how does somebody go from that? In that, I state the difference between a terrorist and a freedom fighter is just what side of the line you're on, nothing more. And so it's really understanding that and having a willingness to understand that. So with that, as we sort of come to the close of the second part of the show here, what would you suggest that people look at? What are people not looking at that they need to look at to help themselves? And what do they need to do that maybe they've not considered doing in order to make the kinds of changes that they say they want to make?
First of all, I think it's giving yourself permission to be wrong, giving yourself permission to be wrong about all the beliefs that you've had, all the thoughts that you've taught. Recognizing that is the first step. Adam Grant talks about in his great book, Think Again. It's being able to look at the situation as opposed to trying to defend ferociously your point of view, to be comfortable with recognizing maybe I'm not right here and looking out to try to prove yourself wrong is one thing. A second thing I would suggest, which I find really hard to do, but it's so useful to do. I call it like the vitamins for the mind, or it's like the medicine that tastes awful, but it's good for you, like a really healthy food that just tastes awful. The kale, I'm sure some people love kale, but the kale or whatever it is. If you are, let's say, a staunch Republican and you watch Fox News every night, force yourself to watch CNN for half an hour. If you're a CNN, you hate Trump, this and that, force yourself to watch Fox News. In other words, expose yourself to the other side. And instead of exposing yourself to go, oh my God, they're so full of lies, instead try to imagine that this is the real news. Try to give yourself permission to experience the world through that new lens. Because worst case scenario, it'll help you better able to understand the other folks that you might disagree with politically. And it might give you an understanding which helps you to communicate better with them as well. And then the third and last thing I would suggest is when it comes to inner propaganda, recognizing that you're sometimes wrong, recognizing that there's different points of view out there, you also can go back to your own perspective of yourself and recognize that what input you take in, like many of your listeners, many of your viewers, you're already on the right track. So it's giving people the opportunity to go, how am I going to surround myself with a community which helps me to have more productive, more useful, more empowering beliefs? How am I going to take the actions that someone with empowering, useful, and powerful beliefs would take? Telling myself new stories about who I can be and who I want to be, and understanding how I can change those stories moving forward. Those are the kinds of things that I think will help us to be able to deal more effectively with the many challenges we face. And I think, again, one final thought is, so often we think that we can argue our way out of a problem, but that's not always the way it works, because logic is usually the rationalizing, or as you called it, the rational lies we tell ourselves. Instead, what we need to do is understand it's the stories that we tell ourselves. So what story are you telling yourself about yourself? And recognizing it's just a story is the most important thing, because then we can start to choose the story of our own life where we become the hero that makes the right choices, that allows us to transform our experience and hopefully cultivate the kind of life we want.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, I could definitely go on talking to you for a while, mate. And we will again. I know when your new book comes out, we'll have another conversation about your inner propaganda. Till then, please let people know where they can find out more about you and all your wonderful resources.
OwenFitzpatrick.com, and join the newsletter if you can, OwenFitzpatrick.com/newsletter, or check out the podcast. It's on Spotify and iTunes and all that, and on YouTube as well. Changing Minds is the name of the podcast. Every week, it's either me or me and a wonderful guest, and we have a great chat. And I'm hoping, Dove, next time you're in New York, you'll join us on the podcast as well.
It would be my honor, mate. It would be my honor. Thank you. So we'll make sure that all those are posted in the show notes. So if you didn't catch them, don't worry. We'll make sure all the links are posted there. Remember, those who control the meaning for the tribe also control the movement of that tribe. Leaders committed to positively shaping the political and business landscape know that they've got to tap into what drives human behavior. I'm Dov Barron. I show businesses, teams, and leaders how to harness their emotional source code to move their tribe, because unified actualized meaning is the single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness for all individuals and companies. Remember, we need your help in staying relevant, so please do us a favor. Go to wherever it is that you tune into the show from, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. It makes a huge difference. We're really grateful for you for doing that, and we really appreciate it for all of those of you who are sharing the show with everybody you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about the cult you lead yourself into, the beliefs and stories you feed yourself in order to be a member of a tribe that you may have outgrown. It's not because they're wrong, it's because maybe you've grown out of it. It's possible to outgrow those you surround yourself with. Yes, there is a social cost, but there is a soulful cost in not doing so. I'm Dov Barron. I'm here to assist you, tapping into your deepest meaning to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, in your life, and in your leadership impact. And I am out.